Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this September installment of ICNC's educational webinar series. My name is Steve Chase, and I'm the Manager of Academic Initiatives here at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Today we have three presenters. Marie Dennis and Eli McCarthy are both active members of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and you can find out more about them if you go to our website about this webinar that has detailed information. We also have with us Sharon Erickson-Nepstad, who has academic expertise in studying both Catholic and other faith-based nonviolent activism. And so we're thrilled to have these presenters. So for those of you who want to know more about the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative after the webinar, you can go to CNI's website or get a copy of this book that came out this year by Orbis Press, Choosing Peace, The Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence, which was edited by Marie Dennis. Now, the CNI has many focuses. ICNC wants to focus today, however, on CNI's work to promote civil resistance as an important part of its work within the Catholic Church. And we think that this will be useful to people whether or not you identify as Catholic, because understanding how religious groups can make a contribution to active nonviolent strategies and engagement is really important. And this is a pretty pioneering initiative within the Catholic Church. And so I think we'll get ready. And so Marie, if you, let me explain how to answer questions. So when we get done with the three of them, because it's an hour-long webinar, Marie Dennis will introduce the Catholic Nonviolent Initiative and its engagement through two major conferences with the Vatican. Sharon Erickson-Nepstad will go next, and she'll give more context on the historical role of Catholics in civil resistance movements. And then Eli McCarthy will then share about what the Catholic Nonviolent Initiative is doing to increase the understandings and skills of nonviolent resistance and related tools among Catholics to make a difference. And finally, you, our live webinar viewers, will then have a chance to ask questions about this faith-based initiative to promote nonviolent tools, including civil resistance, as a means to win rights, freedom, and justice. And so there's two ways to ask questions. And I'll review this later, but just to give you a sense, during the presentation, if you'd like to minimize your control panel, you can do that by clicking the little red arrow at the top of your screen that points inward. And you don't have to worry about background noise during the webinar, as all participants are currently muted, except for the presenters and myself, so you won't interfere with the audio. And then during the Q&A portion, as I said, there are two ways to ask questions. One way is we would ask you to have your microphone or your telephone ready. And if you click the raise the hand icon here, that will indicate to me that you want to speak to all the participants and the presenters. And I will name you and unmute you. You can ask your question, and then we'll have the panel to discuss it. But you also, over here, if you don't want to speak on air, you can type in your questions. And then I would just look at them, choose questions, and read them out for our panelists to talk more about. So I think that's everything. So I think we're ready to move on to Marie to open us, giving us some background about the Catholic Nonviolent Initiative. Take it away, Marie.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for joining us today. As many of you will know, for the past 1,300 years, Catholic teaching on war and peace has been largely shaped by the so-called just war tradition. Over time, this tradition has had a significant impact on international humanitarian law, Its intention was to deter violence and war, but too often the reality was exactly the opposite, with disastrous consequences. In the last century, that teaching has begun to shift, giving more attention to the potential effectiveness of nonviolent alternatives, as civil resistance campaigns around the world were amazingly successful. But the just war theory stayed on center stage in church teaching, and very few of the 1.2 billion Catholics in the world learned anything about the power of nonviolent conflict or other nonviolent strategies to realize a just and sustainable peace. The Church, as an international institution, did very little to study or promote potentially compelling nonviolent alternatives, from diplomacy to restorative justice, trauma healing to unarmed civilian protection, and on and on. And few communities learned about nonviolence as a spirituality and a way of life, which is essential to our faith tradition and distinct from pacifism. At times, truly, the Catholic Church was a powerful advocate for nonviolent civil resistance, but that, in fact, was hidden in plain sight for most Catholics. More about that from Sharon. In April of 2016, 85 people from around the world gathered in Rome for what has been called a landmark conference on nonviolence and just peace that was co-sponsored by the Vatican and Pax Christi International. Participants came together to imagine a new framework for Catholic teaching on war and peace that could contribute to the development and appreciation of nonviolent tools for conflict transformation and social change toward just peace. Central to our conversations were the voices of people promoting nonviolent strategies in the midst of horrific violence, from Iraq, Sri Lanka, Colombia, South Sudan, the DR Congo, Mexico, Afghanistan, Palestine, El Salvador, the Philippines, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Uganda, and more. Their testimony about the urgent need to end war and about the research of Maria Stephan, Erica Chenoweth, and others about the effectiveness of nonviolent ways to do so were extremely powerful. In the formal appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence that was delivered to Pope Francis, conference participants urged the Church to promote nonviolence, including nonviolent civil resistance, using every tool at the disposal of the Church throughout the world, and to adopt a new nonviolent framework for Church teaching on war and peace. The Catholic Church has a well-developed network of universities, seminaries, religious communities, parishes, publications and media outlets, and diplomatic presence in almost every country and at all major international organizations. Through this network, we believe that the Church could make a tremendous contribution to the development and acceptance of nonviolent approaches to a more peaceful world. In response to our appeal, Pope Francis wrote on January 1st, 2017, his World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, a style of politics for peace. It was the first such document on nonviolence that we can find in the Catholic tradition. In 2018, as Steve said, Orbis Books published Choosing Peace, the Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence, that documents the Rome Conference in April of 2016 and includes many of the reflections from participants who came from contexts of violence and war and who called us to imagine a Catholic Church recommitted to nonviolence and peace. In 2016, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that grew out of the conference. Since 2016, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has engaged in a very serious conversation with the Vatican and with the local church around the world, including in many war zones, about the breadth and potential of nonviolent strategies to further sustaining peace. An ambitious international roundtable process involving theologians, peace practitioners, Experts in nonviolent conflict, activists, and academics from all over the world produced over 2 years of meeting virtually on a regular basis, a major document as a contribution to Catholic teaching on the theology and spirituality of nonviolence and on nonviolent strategies toward just peace. That material that was collected from the various roundtables formed the basis of our discussion at a second conference that was co-sponsored by the Vatican and Pax Christi International that took place in this past April, in April of 2019. In a final statement from that conference, participants asked the Church to, quote, advocate for increased public and private, intellectual and financial investment in education for nonviolence and in key nonviolent practices, such as nonviolent resistance, nonviolent civilian-based defense, unarmed civilian protection, trauma healing, and restorative justice. Participants said, we strongly urge the Church to bring nonviolence from the periphery of Catholic thought on war and peace to the center, to mainstream nonviolence as a spirituality, a lifestyle, a program of societal action, and a universal ethic. We believe that the potential impact of such a commitment, both inside the Church and in the public arena, is huge. Thank you.
My role on this panel is to provide a bit of historical context to this initiative. And my main point is to underscore that this is not foreign to the Catholic tradition at all. In fact, it's been part of the Catholic tradition since the Church's inception. And I say that because we have substantial evidence that the early Christian Church was pacifist for the first 4 centuries of its existence. We have scriptural evidence, we have theological writings from early church leaders that explicitly stated Christians cannot serve in the military because it contradicts Christ's commandment to love one's enemies. We also have evidence that these weren't just theological beliefs, that people lived these convictions. For instance, we have historical evidence that some of the early Christians were executed for their conscientious objection status, where they refused to be conscripted into the military. But all of this changed in the 4th century when Constantine, the Roman emperor, converted to Christianity. And as the emperor, he faced a dilemma. On the one hand, he had a responsibility to protect his citizens. And on the other hand, as a Christian, he had the responsibility to follow Christ's teaching to love one's enemy. So it was out of that situation that the just war tradition really was developed, and as Marie talked about, became the basis for the Catholic Church's position from the 4th century all the way to the 21st century. There have been periods of time when Catholic nonviolence has been revived. In the 13th century, for example, St. Francis really highlighted the role of gospel nonviolence, and himself, he traveled to the Crusades and actually tried to convince some of the leading generals to stop the fighting. But I want to focus my presentation today primarily on 20th century Catholic resistance. And I'm going to begin with the Catholic worker movement, which was founded in 1933 by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. And they really founded the movement because they wanted to combine the Catholic social teachings of the Church with a commitment to the working class and the poor. And they were very clear that charity wasn't enough, that reform wasn't enough. They were calling for a social revolution. But because they were pacifists, they were determined that this social revolution needed to be fought nonviolently. They wrote about these ideas in their newsletter, but they also put these ideas into action. And in fact, they were very much tactical innovators, experimenting with creative forms of civil resistance. So one of their first actions, one of their first direct campaigns was in the 1950s. And the initial Catholic Worker House was located in New York City that had passed the Civil Defense Act that made it mandatory for all citizens of the city to participate in air raid drills. So when the sirens went off, everyone was supposed to go to their designated shelter. But these Catholic workers felt that this not only wouldn't provide any real viable protection in the event of a real attack, but that the drills were really designed to encourage acceptance of the arms race. So they decided that they would not cooperate with it. And as the photo here illustrates, they gathered in Central Park to protest the drills and the nuclear arms race. Now, they got arrested, but the following year, more people joined them. And year after year, we see growing numbers of people gathering in Central Park, not only to resist the air raid drills, but the expanding nuclear arms race. By 1960, about 2,000 people were not cooperating with the air raid drills. And at that point, the city personnel realized that they had no effective way of enforcing the drills, and they suspended their policy. This happened in the 1950s. As we move into the 1960s, one of the focal points for Catholic resistance was the Vietnam War. And early on, there were a number, particularly of young Catholic workers, who were protesting it. But once the draft was enacted, they began to think about how they could make this a statement beyond just their own personal convictions. So a number of them decided to burn their draft cards in front of a military induction center in Manhattan in 1965. And it just so happened that Life magazine captured that in a photograph and put that photograph on the cover of their magazine, which caught the attention of congressional representatives. Congress quickly passed legislation that made it illegal to do so and punishable by 5 years in prison or $10,000 fines. But just a few weeks after the laws were passed, a young Catholic worker named David Miller decided that he was going to let Congress know that this would not deter any war resistance. He publicly destroyed his draft card and became the first person prosecuted under the new laws. Shortly after his arrest, 5 other Catholic workers burned their draft cards in Union Square. And before committing the act, one of them read a statement. The mutilation of human beings in Vietnam has become a civic virtue. Now, the mutilation of a scrap of paper becomes a grave crime against the state. There were other Catholics who were not in the age range to be conscripted, but nevertheless wanted to resist the war. And during this time, there was a lot of conversation in Catholic circles about how do we move from protest to resistance, because people were recognizing that protest wasn't really doing much to stop the war. Protest is basically people stating their opposition to it, but not actually interfering or obstructing the war-making process. So some of these other Catholics decided that they would also interfere with the conscription process by raiding draft boards. The first draft board raid happened in the fall of 1967 in Baltimore, when 4 people entered the draft board office, took out conscription files, and destroyed them by pouring bottles of their own blood over the files. A few months later, another action took place in Catonsville, Maryland, where 9 different Catholics, priests, nuns, and lay people pulled out hundreds of files, brought them out to the parking lot, and burned them using homemade napalm, the same chemical that had burned so many children in Vietnam. They released a statement to the media saying, "We destroy these draft cards not only because they exploit young men, but they also represent misplaced power concentrated in the ruling class in America. We confront the Catholic Church, other Christian bodies, and synagogues of America with their silence and cowardice in the face of our country's crimes." After the Vietnam War ended, people were thinking about these tactics and how they could use them to resist the nuclear arms race. And that was the start and the foundation for the Plowshares movement. The first Plowshares action took place in 1980, and they decided to target a General Electric plant outside of Philadelphia that was developing first-strike nuclear weapons. And they did this in part because the general public had been told we had a policy of deterrence. We're never going to be aggressive. We're just trying to keep up pace with our enemy nations. But these weapons were indicative of a shift towards first-strike capacity. So a number of people gathered together. They entered the General Electric plant pretending to be workers, and they were carrying with them household hammers and bottles of their own blood. Miraculously, they found their way into a room that had nose cones for several nuclear missiles. They pulled out their hammers and began damaging these nose cones, hammering upon them to enact the prophet Isaiah's vision of beating swords into plowshares. And then they poured blood, both to signify what these weapons were designed for, but also the Catholic symbolism of sacrifice and redemption. And even though these activists were sentenced to several years in prison, the movement spread. And actually, to date, there's been nearly 100 actions in the US, Europe, and Australia. These are all examples of Catholics who wanted to create their own movements to address wars and militarism. But I also want to talk a little bit about how the Catholic Church and Catholic activists have been important in national struggles for democracy. And here we have pictures of Poland's Solidarity movement, which is a well-known example of this. John Paul II was elected Pope in 1978. The following year, he traveled to his home country of Poland to give a speech in which he talked about the right of freedom of expression and the basic right to human dignity. This inspired people all over the country, but particularly dock workers in Gdansk, who began to organize strike and formed a free trade union that they called Solidarity. And despite significant government repression, the imposition of martial law, the movement really rapidly expanded, mobilizing to millions of people to resist the state, calling for democracy. They realized that their strength was in their numbers, not in any kind of military capacity. And so they relied on the techniques of civil resistance. And the Catholic Church supported this movement by providing religious rituals that sustained motivation. It reinforced nonviolent discipline. It offered free spaces for activists to meet and to plan and to strategize. Real quickly, I'm going to mention another case, and that is of the Philippines People Power movement, also in the 1980s. During this time period, 95% of the Philippine population was Catholic. And they were also increasingly becoming aware that they were going to need to transform the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. In fact, Catholic bishops had publicly denounced the regime's human rights abuses and fraudulent electoral practices. They knew that the day would come when they would have to push Marcos out of office, and they wanted this process to happen nonviolently. So the bishops in the Philippines invited nonviolence trainers from the International Fellowship of Reconciliation to come to the Philippines, and they went from parish to parish, training people in the philosophy and ideas of nonviolence and the techniques of civil resistance. Now, in 1984, the main opposition leader returned to the Philippines to run against Marcos in an election. He was assassinated as he came out of the plane and stepped onto the tarmac. They knew that this was a turning point, and so they mobilized all of the people within these parishes who began a series of actions. And when international pressure forced Marcos to hold a presidential election, they knew that he was going to try to steal the election. So they organized international observers of the elections, and they documented the fraud. When Marcos nonetheless still proclaimed presidential victory, they initiated an entire campaign of civil resistance. And the turning point came when two of the top military leaders got onto the television station and said that they were defecting. And they knew that this was a death sentence for them. So immediately, the Cardinal of the Philippines got onto the Catholic radio station and called on people in the church to go down and form a nonviolent barrier around these two defectors. It turned into a showdown with soldiers coming into the square and facing off with these citizens. But priests, nuns, Catholic lay people stood in front of the tanks, speaking with the soldiers and urging them not to carry out orders to repress. Within 4 days, an estimated 80 to 90% of troops had actually defected and joined the crowds, and Marcos fled the country. Now, it's not merely Catholic activists who've been preaching and practicing nonviolence. I want to emphasize that all of these efforts have also led to religious leadership taking important stances. For instance, the US bishops released a document, The Challenge of Peace, that called for nuclear disarmament and which stated that the development and use of nuclear weapons was a sin. And of course, Pope Francis has also made a statement that the followers of Christ should embrace nonviolence. So in conclusion, the idea of nonviolence is not foreign to the Catholic Church. There's a long-standing tradition dating back to the Church's very beginnings. And this Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is building off this rich history as it once again calls upon the Catholic religious leadership and members of the Church to once again commit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you all. Thanks for being part of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the CNI is advancing nonviolent civil resistance. So let me begin with an image from our 2016 conference of Sister Nazik Mahdi from Iraq, where she pleaded with us to stop the militarization of her country. She said, quote, "War is the mother of ignorance, isolation, and poverty. I say this as a daughter of war. We can't respond to violence with worse violence. In order to kill 5 violent men, we have to create 10 violent men to kill them. This encourages the exhausting spiral of violence up and up. It's like a dragon with 7 heads. You cut one and 2 others come up." So the agenda for my piece is 3 parts: education and dialogue, part 1, part 2, a new moral framework called a just peace ethic, and part 3, nonviolent praxis. So education and dialogue. This is a key focus of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. We have a global education committee that is engaging with large networks like the International Federation of Catholic Universities and the Congregation of Catholic Education at the Vatican to produce teaching resources for a wide variety of learning spheres, from universities to faith formation in parishes to seminaries and so forth. We're also involved in identifying peace studies programs in Catholic universities, particularly those that require a course in nonviolence, and creating resources for other universities to either have such a course or to start their own peace studies programs. For example, the Pope recently called on the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome to develop their own peace studies program. Another piece of the education sphere is a number of university events all around the world. In the US, for example, we've had about a dozen different university events, dialoguing with theologians and activists, but also at times bishops. For example, the University of San Diego, we had a dialogue with Bishop McElroy and military leaders from the US military. And another piece of this education initiative is training. So we have various participants that offer nonviolence training around the world, such as Pache Benny here in the United States, but also providing training resources, such as the SNAP training that came from the US Institute of Peace on strategic nonviolence and peace building. The second part of the presentation is to look at the new moral framework that is developing out of the CNI and weaving together a lot of trends in World Council of Churches and interreligious dialogue and peace studies more generally. So this framework that we're working with is a nonviolent just peace ethic. It's both transformational but also preventative of violence. These norms that I'll share with you in a moment apply at all stages of conflict. They are there to guide our strategy and our action choices. And the logic is that an action must either enhance or at least not obstruct these norms. And there are three categories or spheres of these norms. Before I kind of jump into them, one particular thing you might look for is how would these impact nonviolent civil resistance? So for example, there are some key ways that they would really strengthen such civil resistance by providing or enabling better nonviolent discipline, stronger unity in a movement, better clarity about the truths that are part of our adversary, and more sustainable transformation, particularly after the adversary or the unjust government loses power. So the first sphere is called developing virtues and skills to engage conflict well. And these include the following norms: sustaining spiritual disciplines like meditation or prayer or discernment, virtuous habits such as the virtue of empathy, education and training in skills such as nonviolent communication, social analysis of root causes, and gender, racial, and needs-based analysis. Participatory processes would be a fourth norm, and fifth, forming nonviolent peacemaking communities, institutions, and cultures. The second sphere is breaking cycles of violence. So this would include norms like reflexivity, which is keeping our means consistent with our ends. Rehumanization, which includes the language we use, the image creation of the other we develop, and the narratives that we emphasize. Conflict transformation and dialogue would be about drawing adversaries in the direction of friendship or towards friendship. Further norms include acknowledging the responsibility for harm, such as restorative justice or trauma healing, nonviolent direct action, which explicitly includes nonviolent civil resistance, unarmed civilian protection, and nonviolent civilian-based defense, and integral disarmament. This is a norm which refers to both drawing down the external weapons around us, but also the weaponization of our hearts, which occurs through bitterness and hatred and so forth. The third and final sphere or category of this ethic is building sustainable peace. And this includes the norms of relationality and reconciliation, human dignity and human rights, robust civil society and a just governance, ecological justice and sustainability, and economic, gender, and racial justice. So there is a book coming out called A Just Peace Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence, which takes this ethic and reflects with it and actually transforms it in the midst of various cases of conflict. So we have a number of US domestic cases, but also a number of international cases. So in the US, we look at things like racism and immigration. Internationally, we look at the South Sudan Civil War, the conflict with ISIS, gang violence in El Salvador, and even an essay by Maria Stephan on peace building and nonviolent resistance. Now, these norms are particularly consonant with the sustaining peace agenda that is developing at the United Nations. But what they offer uniquely to this agenda is an ethic, a set of ethical norms that can help or assist the meta policy which the sustaining peace agenda is. So it does this by enhancing the potential of strategic nonviolence to generate more sustainable transformation, not merely to overthrow the dictator or change an unjust policy. And the particular norms that are especially helpful include things like the spiritual disciplines like meditation, the attention to virtues like empathy, compassion, humility, hospitality, rehumanization, that norm, as well as the dignity of all and reconciliation. So this just peace ethic has some particular advantages, such as advantages over the just war ethic that we heard about earlier. For example, you see on the screen some of the limits of the just war ethic, whereas the just peace ethic is better equipped to address those limits. It's less likely to get us it's not going to justify war as the just war ethic does. It's less likely to get us stuck in cycles of violence, even when war appears just, like World War II or Libya in 2011. It's more likely to address the root causes of violence and build sustainable peace. It'll better equipped to deal with structural and cultural dimensions rather than to enable structural and cultural violence through like the preparation for war or the dehumanization which comes along with war that the just war ethic sometimes legitimates. It better helps us form ourselves as courageous nonviolent peacemakers. We're consistent with human dignity and ecological care. And unlike the just war ethic, it does not obstruct the goal to outlaw and to end war. So the last part here is the nonviolent praxis. And there's three kind of sets of things to mention to get our discussion moving. One is that we are doing a lot of work to promote unarmed civilian protection. There are people in our group who have been doing advocacy at the United Nations, such as Mel Duncan with the Nonviolent Peace Force and others. We've also done advocacy at the US government to get them to invest more in unarmed protection, such as in South Sudan, they already have some investment, but we're trying to scale that up more broadly. Promoting organizations like the Nonviolent Peace Force, Christian peacemaker teams, but also local peace teams in our neighborhoods, like DC Peace Team in Washington, DC, or the Meta Peace Team in Detroit, Michigan. There are a number of global examples of CNI participants that have been engaged in or have started to engage more since CNI kicked off in terms of nonviolent resistance. We have examples of this in the Philippines, in South Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Mexico, where they're dealing with the numbers of disappeared people, in Kenya, where there's direct engagement with armed actors, in Sri Lanka, and Croatia, and so forth. Now, one final example here in the US is we have been part of a campaign, a nonviolent campaign for immigrant children, a Catholic nonviolent campaign. So the context here in the US is that we still are detaining children, sometimes alone, sometimes with families. At least 7 kids have died over the past year through this process. There's inhumane treatment, no soap, sleep on the floor, sickness, lack of food, no showers, toothbrushes, and so forth. So this campaign kicked off in July of this year to galvanize the Catholic community to take more strategic risks. So going beyond the dialogical approaches associated with the peace-building framework of contacting your congresspersons, having a direct meeting, making a statement, for example. So we're using strategic mechanisms such as SMART goals, which abbreviates into specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals, but also a theory of change, credible messengers, spectrum of allies, broad range of constructive and obstructive nonviolent tactics. So we're integrating strategic nonviolence with the virtue of nonviolence and the spirituality of prayer and fasting, not to dehumanize our adversary, and recognizing the peace of truth, their dignity of all. So the DC action in July 18th had about 200 people, 71 off of civil disobedience in the Senate building. A 90-year-old religious sister was part of it. Over 100 media articles, multiple countries picked it up. Since then, with our coalition partners beyond the Catholic community, about 2,500 kids have been released from the 2 major temporary facilities. 1 new project was suspended and new legislation has been introduced. Just yesterday, we had 400 people gather in Newark, New Jersey with Cardinal Tobin, one of the main leaders of the Catholic Church in the US. About 50 risked arrest as part of that demonstration. So our next phase is to go to El Paso, Texas, October 11th through the 13th. So in conclusion, we've looked at the educational efforts, the moral framework, the nonviolent praxis. I hope you will walk with us, help us to learn from your experience, promote our activities such as our website, consider endorsing the appeal on the website, encouraging Catholics in your area to get connected with CNI, and take risk with us to resist and transform injustice in our world. Peace be with you.
Thank you, Eli and Sharon and Marie. If all the presenters can get their cameras on so people can see them. And I just want to review for people what the 2 ways to do the questions. So one is you can raise your hand by clicking the little hand button. And if I see you, I would be able to tell you to, so you could voice on your mic so everybody can hear your question and then the panel can respond. The other way is you can type in your question, and I see that people are beginning to do that. So let me first pose this question. Is somebody wrote in and they were talking about how do you see this sort of empirical study of civil resistance and its potential effectiveness affecting certain Catholic social justice movements where in the past, like some liberation theology, based communities in Central America during the 80s, sort of were saying, well, reluctantly, but sometimes you need to use armed struggles to end authoritarian regimes. And so the question is how do you see some of this new research about what's truly effective impacting or potentially impacting Catholic activism around the world?
Well, maybe I'll start a response. it is a great question and a really important one. I think that in reality, what has probably attracted the most attention to what the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is trying to do has been the evidence, the result of the research that many have been doing. I have seen that happen both at a grassroots level, but I've also seen that have a very significant impact on Catholic leadership. Part of the reason is that, as you suggested, Steve, or as the questioner did, the ultimate goal for many people, and very much for the people in the Catholic tradition, is to end war, to protect lives, to ensure the possibility of creating a just society. The more we're able to show that nonviolent approaches are effective or more effective than any use of violence, the more likely they are that they'll be used. So one of the things that we've also been strongly encouraging among, Eli mentioned Catholic universities and our effort to engage them in this effort, is we are hoping that Catholic universities will encourage additional deep, serious research about what works in what situations, and also the gathering of examples and experience from very different contexts has been very important. I think the very practical belief or evidence that nonviolence works is very significant in moving us toward reinvestment in nonviolent approaches.
Thank you. Eli or Sharon, do you have any additional comments?
Let me just say that those of us who are social scientists who have been trying to collect this data over the years are always amazed at how many misconceptions exist about nonviolence and civil resistance. So people often think that it's not as effective. They think that violence is going to be faster, and the work that we've been referring to here by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen document that, at least in historical cases, it's been much more efficient and quick to use nonviolence. People assume that it can't be used against dictatorships. It's only something that's viable in a democracy. And again, what the research is showing is that it's more often used in a dictatorship. And it's effective there for a variety of reasons. And this isn't just something that's come out with social science research. King talked about this back in the civil rights movement, that if you think about the African-American civil rights struggle, African-Americans were only about 12% of the US population. It's not realistic that if they'd taken up weapons that they would have been able to win against a very well-armed state government. So there's a lot of data that are out there, but we really need people to be disseminating that information, because the stereotypes of it being slow and ineffective and not viable in authoritarian contexts just simply isn't the case. And when people learn about the research and the empirical evidence, they often are much more willing to consider it. And in fact, what the data say, at least in this one study, is that historically speaking, nonviolence has been about twice as effective as violent campaigns have been. Now, it's not a panacea. It doesn't work in all circumstances, and people have to prepare for that. But the research does show that compared to violent struggles, it's a better option for obtaining one's goals and creating a more just society.
Great, thank you. We have somebody who wants to ask their question directly, so I'm going to unmute you, Alan, and you can go ahead and ask your question of the panelists.
Hi, I live in Florida in the United States, and we have a whole lot of adults and retirees here.
Alan, could you speak up? It's a little hard to hear you.
I don't know how to, if I yell a little louder, is that better?
Yeah, just speak up. It'll be fine.
All right. I live in Florida. My question is, I appreciate the efforts at education through universities and parochial schools and high schools and so on. Are there tools or resources that parishes could use for adult faith formation, or at the parish level or deanery level or diocesan level, to spread the word on the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative?
Yeah, I can take that one.
Yeah.
So on our website, nonviolencejustpeace.net, there's a tab called Resources. And in that tab, there's a variety of resources for different types of groups, as well as particular ones focused on different categories. So I would encourage you to start there. And then in terms of like some specific things, there's a Just Faith program, which has different modules that a parish has often used for adult learning, adult faith formation. Is a good go-to source. They have a couple ones on nonviolence as well.
And maybe I would just add to that that we are absolutely not reinventing the wheel, that there are good resources being produced that have been produced for many years, and we are both directing people toward those resources, but also have begun to focus our attention at resources that are either already developed or need to be developed in different cultural contexts around the world, so that we begin to cross-pollinate the experience from different communities, many at a local level, to see what resources are most effective where. So we'd be happy to have your input in terms of what would be most useful in your own context.
So it sounds like that people with ideas about that, after looking at the website that Eli was talking about, should be in communication with you about sharing things. That's great. Marie, since you just answered, there's a question that was directed to you about your opening statement, wanting to hear more about this notion about what you're describing as nonviolence, which from your framework includes sort of the techniques and skills and strategies of civil resistance. And you described that view is somewhat distinct from pacifism. And so this person is wondering sort of to hear a bit more about that. And it reminds me of a comment by a nonviolent action scholar and activist, George Lakey, who back in 1973 noticed, if you look at civil resistance historically, most pacifists don't engage in nonviolent resistance, and most people who engage in nonviolent resistance aren't pacifists. So if you could just sort of explore how that plays out within the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and the church, that potential sort of overlap or tension between those two perspectives.
Sure, I can make a beginning. As you said, Steve, we understand pacifism as distinct from a commitment to nonviolence, to active nonviolence, to nonviolent action. Many in the Catholic tradition are pacifist. Historically, that's been very true, but not all are. I think that what we are suggesting is that because we are learning more about both the scriptural tradition, the story of Jesus as a nonviolent activist, as someone who modeled a way of dealing with a very violent situation using nonviolent strategies and nonviolent approaches, that we are trying to both highlight that and look at the effectiveness of nonviolent approaches that we were talking about earlier, in order to encourage more and more investment in nonviolent approaches, whether or not someone is necessarily committed to never accepting any use of violence under any circumstance. And that we believe that nonviolence, the effectiveness of nonviolence, and the consistency of nonviolence with what we claim to believe as people committed to the dignity of life, that we believe nonviolence speaks for itself. And so what we're trying to do is to encourage the investment in nonviolent approaches, not necessarily a move to accept pacifism. That is a personal decision that people will make, but we think that nonviolent action needs to be supported. There needs to be much more investment in the exploration of what is effective in what circumstances. We need to do much more to exchange the stories of our experiences with nonviolent action in different circumstances. We are absolutely supporting, encouraging, trying to learn about nonviolent resistance, civil resistance, nonviolent conflict, if you will. But we also believe that nonviolence, nonviolent action is can be considered a very broad spectrum of activities that engage a society in moving toward a just peace without promoting or using violence. And that includes, we're seeing more and more, for example, that restorative justice practices or trauma, responding to the experience of trauma can go a long way toward promoting the kind of sustainable and just peace that we are seeking. So there is we think a significant, very broad ability for people who may have different personal value systems to see nonviolent strategies as both effective and worth supporting. And we think that the reason that we have been trying to encourage the Catholic Church institutionally to move in this direction is that we believe that the Church actually has the institutional and organizational and financial capacity to show the strength of nonviolent options that in themselves are convincing, whether or not I personally am a pacifist. So yes, we are distinguishing between pacifism and a commitment to nonviolence, although we think there is a great deal of overlap between, we will find much common ground between the different sort of approaches to violence and nonviolence. We just believe there has to be a whole new paradigm constructed that will enable us to think primarily of nonviolent approaches, no matter what the situation is. And we think that that is consistent with the instincts of most people. It's just not what our society is promoting right now.
Yeah,
Thank you, Marie. Oh, Eli, go ahead.
A couple real small things. So we're trying to broaden the understanding and commitment to nonviolence, that it is particularly a positive reverence for human dignity. It's what enables us to most illuminate and live in accord with our dignity. So in that sense, it's a power of love in action. But it's also this spirituality or virtue. So by virtue, we mean it's a character habit we can develop in our ordinary daily life. And if we really identify it as such and work on that, when we get into these tough conflict situations, we're more likely to imagine a range of nonviolent possibilities and stay committed to it further through the process. So it's that, as well as a strategic method and a constructive force for social justice and protecting people and so forth.
Great, thank you. Now we have somebody who wants to ask their question live. I may not be pronouncing your name right, but Kumbalani, I've unmuted you. You could ask your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Kumbalani Maposa. I'm in Zimbabwe, in Southern Africa. Maybe my question directly, maybe to all of you can help me, is I'm trying to find a way, how do we distinguish, especially in areas where you have dictatorship, and when the church gets involved in nonviolence, how in nonviolent direct action, for instance, and civil resistance, how do we help the church so that it doesn't end up being labeled maybe as regime change agents, and not focusing on its mandate because there is a script like perceived idea of what the church should do, and in most dictatorship, the church should not be involved in governance issues. So how do we separate the church and such tags like being labeled to be regime change and being linked to opposition political parties, for instance?
So who would like to take that important question on?
Well, I think there's a role for religious institutions, not just Catholicism, but a variety of religious institutions, to speak to the moral issues in a society and not to make it a political agenda per se, although one can see political ramifications from those commitments. But I think that as moral leaders, religious communities can say, we stand for the dignity of all human life, and that means no human rights abuses. We stand for the liberties that enable people to fulfill their potential. So I think that religious institutions can serve that important space of addressing these issues and giving rationales for it and speaking for it and supporting people in those efforts, rather than saying vote for a particular party or your job is to overturn this particular regime. But there's a role, speaking as moral agents, that have political ramifications. And I think that is an important role for religious leaders to play and religious communities.
I would just completely agree with that. Yes, for sure.
Okay, well, we're getting close to time, so there's lots of questions here that what I will do is I will forward those on to the panelists, and we'll get some written responses to as many questions as possible. And then when I send out an email to everybody who's been registered for this webinar, which you will have a link to the recorded version of this, but we'll also have information about sort of the additional questions. But there's last one here that's probably relatively quick, which that I'm seeing here, so I think I'll ask it, is given that this is, the Catholic Church is international and involves people who speak many, many different languages, what is the Catholic Nonviolent Initiative doing in terms of translating materials? Particularly this person is asking about materials in Spanish, but it would be interesting just to hear either what you're already doing or what you hope to be doing about reaching out in other languages.
Two initial responses. Yes, we are making every effort to translate, at least to have our materials in French, Spanish, English, and to some extent Italian. But we are also, because this is an international effort, and much of the work that's being done is being done locally in different parts of the world. And so obviously that work will be done in whatever is the local language. So in the Philippines, or in Kenya, or in Sri Lanka, or Japan, as well as in many different parts of Latin America. Local communities. Because the church, as many churches, the Catholic Church is present in local communities around the world. This effort is rooted in local contexts with local people engaging in the exploration of what nonviolent action, what nonviolent options look like in their own context, in their own situations. And so, yes, we do have materials in many different languages and hope to have more.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would just like to add that the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict has a resource library that's available, and we currently have articles and various resources that are translated in 70 different languages, so people can go to the ICNC website and do that. We also have a number of documentary films on nonviolent civil resistance, including some case studies where the Catholic Church and Catholics have played a major role in fighting for rights, freedom, and justice. And a number of those films have been dubbed or subtitled in a variety of languages. So we're glad to help out there. I think we'll have to go on, and I just want to thank people for listening. If there's further questions that you have besides the ones that have already been typed in, you can send them here. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter, and there's the website where you can go and you can find out information about translations and other webinars. And next month, we're going to have on Thursday, October 17th, an interesting one that also touches on sort of religious dimensions of conflict, which is how some research that's been done on how activists have actually been challenging jihadist proto-states, which have a very fundamentalist perspective, and how nonviolent resistance and action may actually help people take some agency to improve their situation under those very difficult circumstances. And I think that would be our last slide, but we're going to end up now, and there'll be a poll for all the participants. We'd love to hear your feedback. And I just want to thank Eli, Marie, and Sharon for taking the time and sharing that. And we're really excited about all the participants who have joined us today. And we'll try to get some of the unanswered questions answered. Thank you all very much.